We are delighted to welcome back Kim Iverson. Kim, how was your honeymoon?
It was amazing. I had an amazing time. So yes, now I'm married. I got married, ran off, and we did our honeymoon the very next morning. We like fell asleep at 2:00 in the morning the night of the wedding. We had to be up at 4 a.m. to leave for our honeymoon. So we just jetted off, and now I'm back and feeling great. So had a great time.
Glad you had a great time.
Congratulations. We're very happy to see you back.
But now we want to know what's on your radar. So tell us that.
Oh, boy. Okay, well, shots for tots. That's on my radar. The campaigns to get 6 months to 5-year-olds across the country the COVID vaccine. Those programs began rolling out these past couple of days after the FDA granted Moderna and Pfizer emergency use authorization. Now, local governments set up vaccination centers, politicians staged photo ops. Biden has been encouraging parents to get their toddlers the vaccine. But there's a problem. Parents don't seem to want it. News outlets across the country have been reporting about low turnout and empty centers. And you might expect that in certain parts of the country, like red states or in Florida, where Ron DeSantis didn't order any. But this was even happening in New York City. At a high-profile center set up in Times Square, the city's health commissioner came out with cameras, hoping to greet long lines of relieved, grateful parents, but instead saw the opposite: no lines and empty chairs. Turns out parents are not convinced their tots need the shots after all. So let's break down the actual risk for young children, the data or lack of data from the clinical trials, and some of the frightening chatter about mandating the vaccines in order to bring up compliance. Though young kids have the lowest risk of severe COVID outcomes, they aren't at zero risk. Some kids have died. Since the beginning of the pandemic over 2 years ago, about 440 kids, 4 years old and younger, have died, and thousands of kids have been hospitalized. But it is hard to know if any of this was because of COVID or with COVID. That distinction still hasn't been clarified after all this time. And it's because there isn't a uniform set of rules for how any hospital or county counts COVID deaths and hospitalizations. But let's just take the number at face value for the sake of the argument and say that these 440 kids did in fact die from COVID and nothing else. That's about 200 per year. Annually, according to the CDC, influenza kills anywhere between 50 to 200 kids under the age of 5. And that's with roughly about 70% of the kids in that group getting the flu shot. It's considered very rare for a toddler or an infant to die from the flu. Now compare this to car fatalities, which kill around 500 to 600 toddlers and infants per year. And that's with seatbelts and airbags. Even then, a child being killed in a car accident is still considered extremely rare. And though it happens, parents are not hesitating to load their kids up in the car and go places. So we can see there's a risk of a negative COVID outcome for this age group, but it is very, very low. You could then say we could maybe lower it even more with COVID vaccines, and theoretically that's certainly possible, but it's only theoretical. Plus there are all of the other unknowns like side effects. So now let's look at the data from the clinical trials. The clinical trials used to get these vaccines emergency use authorization were tiny. Moderna gave their vaccine to about 4,800 kids, 5 and under, and gave a placebo to about 1,500 kids. And Pfizer's was even smaller, with 992 kids, 4 and under, being given the actual vaccine, and about 450 getting the placebo. None of the kids in any group ended up with severe COVID, so they can't make any claims whatsoever about whether or not these vaccines prevent hospitalizations or deaths. The only thing they could test for was symptomatic COVID. Which kids got the sniffles and a fever? That's what they looked for. Now, the Moderna trial showed with very low confidence that their vaccine seemed to prevent symptoms 50.6% of the time for the kids under 2 and 36.8% of the time for the kids between 2 and 5. So it's 50-50 or less that if you get your kid vaccinated, the vaccine will prevent symptoms. And those results came with very low confidence. The confidence level was down to 12.5%. Now, the Pfizer data was slightly better, but remember, it was with a fraction of the participants. They showed after not 1, not 2, but 3 doses of their vaccine, it was 75% effective against symptomatic COVID, but their confidence levels were significantly worse than Moderna's. They're basically saying they really have no idea if the vaccine works to even prevent symptoms. They think it might. They're willing to place a small bet on it, but they have no idea at all whether or not the vaccine prevents hospitalizations or deaths. They also can't make claims about side effects. Of course, they do make claims. They say that there were no reports of serious side effects. But remember, the rate of myocarditis in teen boys is about 1 in 6,000. These trials didn't even have that many participants, so it's just no way to know. These trials did not test for long COVID. They did not test for multi-system inflammatory syndrome. They didn't test for anything other than whether or not the vaccinated kids got some sniffles, a fever, and a cough. That's it. They looked at the antibody levels induced by the vaccines and then assumed these levels mean the vaccine reduces severe COVID outcomes, but they don't know. It doesn't seem to matter to parents if they know or not, because they aren't lining up in droves to vaccinate their kids. Now, it could be that parents don't feel the urgent need. When seroprevalence data shows over 70% of kids 4 and under have caught and recovered from COVID, many of them without any symptoms at all. And that's what makes this next part so frightening. Some doctors and worried parents are concerned about the low vaccine uptake for toddlers and children under 12 and are now advocating for the government to mandate COVID vaccines. They specifically want to make it impossible for kids to attend school or preschool without having gotten the jab. So far, it's just a small few calling for this, but we know how quickly these seemingly fringe ideas can grow. So what's interesting about this is, we've got all these parents, they're not showing up. Politicians really put a lot of measures on kids, as we've seen throughout this pandemic, all because what now it kind of looks like is that there were just a lot of very loud but very few parents who were screaming about masking children, which obviously did not work. We have 70 to 80% of school kids have already have gotten COVID based on seroprevalence. Now you've got these lawmakers that basically pressured the FDA into approving these for emergency use authorization without really any data at all in incredibly tiny clinical trials. And the parents aren't showing up. So it kind of makes you wonder, who are the politicians actually listening to when they're making policy decisions? Is it these fringe few parents? Because where are they now if they believe that there was such a demand for this?
Yeah.
Well, it does feel like, if people have looked at the evolving information around COVID vaccines and decided it's not worth it for their kids for various reasons, because kids have a lower incidence of hospitalization and bad outcomes, because the vaccines don't do as much to prevent transmissibility as we once thought that they might, because there is some potential effect on lowering the incidence of long COVID, but it's relatively low. It's like in the teens, the percentage of which it lowers the likelihood of getting long COVID. But parents are making the decision not to go ahead and vaccinate their kids. And, that's a perfectly reasonable decision that people are making. However, what's interesting to me is the kind of disincentives that are now being provided by some folks in certain states where they're saying, we're not going to make the vaccine even available, like really pressuring local public health providers not even to make it available and free, so that people, who do want it have to get it through a provider, assuming that they do have a provider. It's interesting that if the people are making these kind of choices and just not showing up for it, that there has to be so much kind of countervailing pressure to limit access to the thing for those who do want it.
Go ahead, Kim.
I was just going to say that was a very libertarian viewpoint, Brianna.
Yeah, very much so. Hey, I'm a libertarian socialist.
I suppose. Because the one thing that I would say to counter that is when you look at the clinical trial data, there was just no data. So a government could say, look, this could have been this looks like a push by either, and probably both, parents that were very, loud and freaking out. I have a friend that's this way. They haven't really left their house still in 2 years because they were waiting for their youngest child to be able to get the vaccine. So you've got those parents, but then you also have big pharma pressure. They're wanting to sell product, obviously. So you've got these two pressures, and it really looks like the FDA approved this. No data at all, just to say, well, maybe 50% of the time it might prevent some sniffles. That's insane without knowing any real long-term side effects. We didn't know about the myocarditis in teen boys until they rolled it out en masse to all of the kids. That's when we found out about it. The clinical trials did not show that. And it was because you just need a larger sample size to get to 1 in 6,000 teen boys in a certain age range in order to find out that they were at this high risk. So, I can understand that a government intervening and saying, hey, you guys just push this through. We don't even really know if it's safe. You don't really know anything about this, actually. So maybe we do want to halt this. Also keeping in mind the United States being the only country in the world offering mRNA vaccines to young kids under the age of 5. That's not happening anywhere else in the world at this point. Some countries in Europe, many countries in the Scandinavian countries, for example, are not even offering it under 12. They still haven't gone that far. So, I think there's maybe some governments going in and saying, I don't know about this. This was rushed.
But I support the right to try movement in general. I think if families want to vaccinate their young kids, they should be allowed to do so. It might not be the choice. I mean, I don't have kids, but if I had them, I don't know if it'd be the choice I'd make for them. It depends on the individual risk profile, even of the young kid. Probably there are some with maybe severe immunocompromised disease issues where even if whatever the risk of the vaccine is, the calculus might be different. So I would definitely allow people to take it if they want. But the crazy thing is any contemplation of having it at the level of government requirement, you have to do it to go to school or anything like that, would just be, which has been, it's not being broadly contemplated now, thank goodness, but was talked about in more kind of blue controlled areas, which is just totally insane. I mean, for one thing, because there's so few people who actually do want to do this, but that would be totally crazy.
Yeah, here in Los Angeles, they certainly did that. They were talking about mandating vaccines for the kids going to schools, and then just too many parents were like, "We don't want to do this." Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. But so I'm glad that's being resisted because we have to get it out of the realm of everybody has to do the same thing. Different people can have different they can read through the data. They can listen to what you're saying, Kim. They can listen to what people who are more advocates of doing it say. Make their own decision. Make the choice they think is best for their family, and that's fine. That's what you do. I'll do me. You do you. That's how we have to get through this thing. It can't just be government says everybody has to do this or nobody can do this or whatever. It's just not going to work in our society.
Yeah. So. I think the biggest takeaway from this, though, is just the fact that the turnout just wasn't there. Yeah. I mean, people thought parents would be lining up in droves. They thought people really, really wanted to vaccinate their toddlers. They just don't. They're not showing up. It's sparse all around the country.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Very telling. Well, thank you, Kim. We are so happy to have your radars back. So we'll have more Rising after this. We'll keep talking with Kim.